What is more fundamental than combining your personal passion and what you're good at to make somebody else's life better in a way that allows you to put food on the table for your family?
Mhm.
I mean, there's
Mm.
nothing more fundamental than that. It's the epitome of the American dream. That's what we think of when we think about America, the land of opportunity. We think of economic rights primarily, right? Like the
Mhm.
ability to lift yourself up by the bootstrap. And so it's so interesting that it's been denigrated in our culture when historically it's been like the definition of America and was chief among the rights that the framers of the Constitution had in mind, particularly after the Civil War. What was more important than property? Property in yourself, the right to earn a living and to keep the fruits of your labors. I mean,
Mhm.
this is the antithesis of slavery is economic freedom.
All right. I'm Laura Forcum, president of the Independence Center and a former marketing professor.
I'm Lauren Hall, professor of political science and author of the Substack, The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life.
This is We Made This Political, a podcast about making politics more about flourishing and less about power.
We talk about living together in families, communities, and as citizens, drawing from our backgrounds in psychology and political science, and as parents. Hi, everyone. This is another episode of We Made This Political, a podcast about making politics less about power and more about flourishing. And we are absolutely psyched to have Anastasia with us today. Laura's going to do the intro, and then we're going to jump right into a bunch of really awesome, well, I hope they're awesome questions. Laura and I are excited about them. So go ahead, Laura. So, welcome, Anastasia Boden. Anastasia is a civil rights attorney at the Pacific Legal Foundation. She fights for economic liberty and equal treatment under the law, and she represents entrepreneurs and small businesses challenging burdensome licensing rules, anti competitive regulations, and certificate of need programs. Her cases have spurred reforms in states including Montana, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. Among her wins are invalidating Houston's busking restrictions and repealing Virginia's happy hour advertising ban. She holds a BA from UC Santa Barbara and a JD from Georgetown University. And I'm most excited about Anastasia's other work communicating about law to the general public. So she has a lot of projects that are really cool. She is the co-creator of the podcast Dist. She authors a SCOTUS Scoop newsletter, writes the In Dissent column for SCOTUS blog, and her incredible Instagram channel, SCOTUS Lady, features tons of interesting videos about legal issues of all kinds. So thank you so much for joining us, Anastasia. We're really excited to talk.
So happy to be here.
All right. Well, I think the first question I have is how do you go from being somebody who says I want to go to law school and practice law to I'm going to explain to the general public like what is happening with the Supreme Court and other legal issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think I got into law because I was a really passionate person. You know, I did like to argue. Let's not lie. I like to argue, but I'm at my best when I'm arguing about something that I really care about. Like there are some attorneys who will just take any side of it just to do it and they enjoy the argumentation for argumentation's sake. But for me, I find my own most personal enjoyment from things when I feel like I would walk through the fire for my clients. I would uh, crawl over glass for them. I would do anything for them. And so, obviously, if you're in the world of ideas and you think these ideas matter, it's important to communicate them to the public. I think there's a connection between culture and law and making positive change. And I noticed that I think attorneys are actually not great communicators to the public inherently, right? Or tend to be very logical, um, tend to be very dry. And maybe there's even sort of a stigma against fun. Like fun is
Mhm.
considered
Mhm.
unserious. If you want to be serious, if you want to be taken seriously, you have to be dry and to the point and all of these things. And the problem is that doesn't that doesn't communicate ideas well. It doesn't change minds actually in the general public. Maybe that's great for courts, but not for the court of public opinion. And so I just felt like I'm so passionate about passion. I'm just like a really passionate person and I wanted to share that passion. I think it's contagious. And so I wanted to try to maybe do things a little bit differently and be an advocate for what I think is right, justice, liberty, all of these things, and to take the stigma away from fun, and also meaning trying to communicate that being logical doesn't mean that you have to have a lack of empathy, right? Like those two
Mhm.
things can be together, and being an empathetic, energetic, passionate voice for our movement.
I love that. Can you talk a little bit more? Sorry, before
No,
we
go
get
ahead.
off that topic, I would love to hear where you are seeing or hearing empathy and like insight kind of being presented as opposed to one another.
Yeah, I mean, truly in the legal world, and especially I think, it's no secret I work for a libertarian law firm. Libertarians tend to be very logical, very based, everything's based on reason. And there is this idea in courts too, right? That courts are supposed to be very sanitized, very um separate from the people. It's all up here. It's all in the world of logic, not in the world of people. And that's just not true. I think even judges, I do, and we could probably talk about this later. Like I trust in institutions and I think that judges are doing their best and they're applying law, not just their personal opinions. But it's crazy to think that they're not persuaded by the way that law affects people, the people in their courtroom, seeing a client in front
Mhm.
of them rather than having that person outside of the courtroom. I think it makes a difference. Um, and so I don't know. I think people just tend to see law as being very dry and boring. And I think it's so much more than that. And I don't know. It just that just seems something to me that people think about law that it should be and is dry and boring, and it's just not true. It's inherently connected to the people in the courts.
Well, this is we're already deviating from our plan, but this is one of my, one of the things that I've been sort of like beating my head against a wall in terms of like how to communicate the importance of, process and procedure. And I think this is an area that I think a lot of people see sort of process and procedure as being counter to like the right outcomes, or like they see situations in which following the process leads to what we think of as maybe unjust outcomes. And especially now that we have this like norm breaking president, this process, breaking president, I think a lot of people, I look at it in terms of like why institutions matter and why do we follow these processes? Like why do the procedures that we think about when we think about like attorneys general and just all of these other kinds of legal institutions, when Tocqueville talked about legal institutions broadly, he talked about them as kind of the conservative heart of democracy. And he didn't mean conservative. He actually used the term like aristocratic. But he didn't mean it as like an elite class. What he meant is that the legal institutions provide, in a really important sense, the memory of a democracy. Right. It's the actual like space where you hold on to these values that you've evolved over centuries. And so when we jettison process and procedure in favor of just like, I want the outcome that my
Mhm.
party wants, there's actually like a lot of costs to that are often hidden in the short term, but they become really ugly in the long term or even the medium term. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Like, I mean, that's another reason why I think legal education is so crucial right now, and yet it's really hard to do because so many people do. Law is very intricate. It's jargon filled. It's hard to
Mhm.
communicate a lot of that stuff really meaningfully.
Yeah. Yeah, I have so many thoughts on that. I mean, it's something we see, and law is actually a really good place to teach these lessons that we see people trying to sacrifice principle for short-term gains, and then you see it come around and, bite you during the next
Mhm.
administration or what have you. I mean, we saw this with Chevron deference. This was,
Mm.
I guess it's, I don't know, we don't want to get too far into these technical doctrines, but had to do with giving deference to administrative agencies. And at the time, it was thought by one party that we need more deference to these agencies because one political party is in power. And so that's going to be a good thing. It's going to take it away from the judges and put it back with these political
Mhm.
institutions that we like. And then, of course, it comes around and a new party's in power. And you're like, wait, wait, wait. Maybe we like the impartiality. Maybe we like the judges. Maybe we need to check on those bureaucrats. And
Mhm.
so law is one of these places where you can see that principle matters in the long term, even though people are craving those short term gains. But the other thing that brings to mind, that question brings to mind, is the idea that people see procedure and substance as separate things when process exists for a reason. It has a substance unto itself, right? Like it's not, we don't follow any process. It's not like you can't make laws by drawing out of names out of a hat, like who's going to get the favor,
Mhm.
we'll draw it out of the hat. That would be a process and it would be an evenly
Mhm.
applied process for everyone, but it wouldn't be a fair process. Fairness is inherent to process as well. And so, it's important to think about why those processes are there. They're not just there for their own sake, they're there for an end. And typically within our constitution, they exist to preserve liberty. And so, it's an interesting thing that people think that process can be dispensed of without realizing that they're not, that there's a reason that they're there. They're not any one process and they're there for your own good.
Mhm. Yeah. So actually on this point, we're going to talk a little bit more about certificate of need laws later and sort of what those are. But I see a lot of focus, particularly from the left, on sort of civil rights and liberties like freedom of speech, voting rights, and those are obviously wonderful. I love those. Right? Those are great rights. Um, but a lot of your work focuses on economic rights, like the right to contract or the right to property. And one of the things that I think is so interesting, having taught American politics for now close to 20 years, is how many I actually stopped using American politics textbooks like 18 years ago because there was no focus on, like, it was all focused on civil rights. And so I want to hear a little bit about your thinking about, like, why is it that economic rights are so important? And also that secondary question of, like, why have we forgotten them? Like, what's the problem that people have with economic rights? And, like, it has like a marketing problem.
Yeah, it really does. And it's so interesting because if you think about fundamental rights, what is more fundamental than combining your personal passion and what you're good at to make somebody else's life better in a way that allows you to put food on the table for your family?
Mhm.
I mean, there's
Mhm.
nothing more fundamental than that. It's the epitome of the American dream. That's what we think of when we think about America, the land of opportunity. We think of economic rights primarily, right? Like the
Mhm.
ability to lift yourself up by the bootstrap. And so it's so interesting that it's been denigrated in our culture when historically it's been like the definition of America and was chief among the rights that the framers of the Constitution had in mind, particularly after the Civil War. What was more important than property? Property in yourself, the right to earn a living and to keep the fruits of your labors. I mean,
Mhm.
this is the antithesis of slavery, is economic freedom. And I think it's been denigrated in our society for a lot of reasons, and in the courts maybe for different reasons. In courts, I think one thing is that, yeah, the courts have made this distinction between so-called civil rights and economic rights, even though economic rights are a civil right. I
Mhm.
consider myself a civil right attorney, right? But one thing is, I think they don't want to be in the business of scrutinizing run-of-the-mill economic regulations because there's so many of them. And they
Mhm.
feel like it's going to put them in a precarious position. People already scrutinize courts and
Mhm.
think that courts are imposing their own opinions on people rather than applying law. And so, given how many economic regulations exist these days, if they were forced to scrutinize every single economic regulation, I think they think it would put them in a pickle, even if I think there's ways to apply law and to make those judgments. So that's one reason. I mean, I think there's also just a cultural thing where, there's this hatred of billionaires. Nobody should be a billionaire. And anybody who's
Mhm.
made a lot of money necessarily must have exploited someone and doesn't deserve to get there. And it's not fair. There's this real denigration around um, wealth and even run of the mill having to have a job. It's like, why should anyone have to work? It's considered dirty. It's considered beneath us. It's considered unfair. And that's a really interesting phenomenon, but you see it more and more, unfortunately, I think, as time goes on and after COVID, nobody wants to go back to work rather than seeing that work is such a privilege. It's such a, I feel like I get so much of my meaning from work, and it doesn't have to be some idealistic, huge, I'm a civil rights attorney. Yes, it's easy to get passion from that, but I get passion from seeing a locksmith. Truly, like the simple beauty of a locksmith coming to your house changing your lock, immediately making your life better. Doing
Mhm.
something that is beneficial for you immediately, that immediate gratification, and exchanging that for money to that he or she can take home and use to pursue their vision of happiness. I mean, that's a really beautiful thing. And yet, you could think of like Mike Rowe and dirty jobs.
Mhm.
How, there's been this denigration of dirty jobs and how we really need to change that and bring back some appreciation for that simple beauty of making people's
Mhm.
lives better, because that's how we make people's lives better, is through economic transactions.
Yeah, and I think too, people have maybe just forgotten because we haven't seen so much of it in this country, like what life is like if you don't have the ability to own the things that you have created. And I think a lot of kind of like the ripple effects of, I know in some countries in Africa, women haven't historically been allowed to be property holders. And so it's like, well, you would never think of this as something that's on the table, right? And so, like, what you begin to understand if you know that that's a problem is like, oh my gosh, this makes all kinds of weird things happen, right? Like, if you're a widow, you've lost your livelihood. And like, can you invest in your farm or your property if you don't own it? A bank won't recognize it. And so I think like part of why we've lost appreciation for this is just because it's not visible to us because of generations, right, of legal protections. But, you know, losing sight of what those provide for us is a problem as well.
Yeah, that's so true.
Emily
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just gonna say Emily Shamley Wright, who's the president of the Institute for Humane Studies, has a great phrase for this. She calls it the great
Mhm,
forgetting, right? And
mhm.
so, like, when you've been protected by certain institutions for so long, they become invisible. And that's a real problem with sort of liberalism broadly, is that liberalism's been so successful over the last, 400 years or whatever, depending on when you peg it starting, that we often don't we just don't recognize the fact that like so much of what we are benefiting from today has been built on the backs of those kinds of institutions that now we're like, well, wait, why does that exist? Can we just get rid of it? Right.
Mhm.
You were going to say something though,
Absolutely.
Anastasia.
Some very much, on the same note that, yeah, we're pretty lucky. Yeah, it reminds me of a case I had involving, there was a quota where you had to have a minimum number of women on boards, corporate boards. And, actually the people who I found to be most offended by this were women who faced real, like meaningful societal and baked into law adversity, meaningful discrimination, and were like, hey, I worked for everything that I got. Um, I don't want this privilege. It's gonna denigrate how far we've come and earned these things on our own.
Mhm.
It's those generations that know what exactly as you were saying, who know what it's like to go without these rights, that can most appreciate these rights.
Mhm. I mean, that makes me wonder, Anastasia, maybe lawyers and attorneys saw this coming, but one of the things that's been really chilling to me with the new administration has been that they have come into all of these government agencies and said, oh, well, we know who was hired on the basis of DEI. It's all of these women, it's all of these people of color, right? So we're just going to fire them. And to me, that's like this horrible and unintended consequence of those policies, right? Is that like, you call into question, right? And like, you don't know why these people were hired for that role. And to assume it was for fulfilling a DEI mandate is completely unfair. But I don't know. I don't know how we get around that problem. But maybe it was something that attorneys and constitutional scholars kind of anticipated coming out of those policies.
Yeah, it is something. One of the things that made it into many of these briefs and into Supreme Court opinions that said, that, a lot of these groups were people in these groups were making it there without government help. But then when you
Hmm.
force people to make those decisions on the base of race or sex, then inevitably you raise those questions. And it's so pernicious to the people that you're trying to help to now make it seem like they wouldn't have gotten there without your help. There's also some studies having to do with, it shows that recipients of benefits on the basis of immutable characteristics don't feel as good about their achievements when they think that they've only gotten it because of a mandate. So yeah, it's something deeply, I think, harmful and problematic about those policies, and something that has been discussed. You can see it in actual Supreme Court opinions having to do with racial preferences in higher education,
Mhm.
where the justices are talking about this. Glenn Lowry said something like this. Keep your hands off my dignity. You're
Mhm.
trying to help me. You're trying to give me dignity. Well, keep your hands off my dignity. I want to earn that myself. I always found that really moving when I saw him say that.
Mhm. So you and I have worked on a couple certificate of need, or like we've kind of been parallel working on like a couple different like certificate of need cases. And I find these really, really fascinating for a number of reasons. And before we went live, Laura and I were kind of talking about a couple really interesting sort of implications of these kinds of regulations. But can you first of all tell listeners what certificate of need laws are? Um, and the other thing that I think your work does really well is it highlights like, and this is something I think about a lot. I think a lot of people think about economic regulations as being primarily like a matter of sort of like economic trade-offs. Like maybe they're like less efficient, or like they make things like slightly like they put like a little bit of sand in the gears, but there might be like really good reasons to have them. But one of the things that your work, I think, did such a nice job of highlighting, and some of the cases that you and I sort of ran into each other on, is the human cost of these economic regulations, and the fact that people just often don't see them because it's a
Mhm.
matter of people being prevented from doing really amazing things. And so it's like hard to put that out there because it's hard to show people things that don't exist because they're not allowed to exist. But anyway, if you can tell us a little bit about like what certificate of need laws are, and then what kind of, some examples of some of those human costs, that'd be great.
Yeah, 100%. Certificate of need laws are fascinating because they're possibly the most un-American law that's on the books, because rather than giving people the freedom to try their hand at their business so long as they are safe and capable, they say that you cannot start a business unless you get permission from the existing businesses first. We call them at my work competitors veto laws, because that's effectively what
Mhm.
they are. So in the normal course, we're all familiar with licensure in this day and age, and it's familiar to most people that you might have to go get a license before getting a job. But at least in most cases, those licenses pretend to have something to do with health or safety, right? Like they say you have to go to school or
Mhm.
have a minimum number of years education or training. And we can talk about why all of that often is actually pernicious under the surface, under the guise of public health and safety. But at least they pretend to have to do with health and safety. Whereas a certificate of need law says that you can only get your permit if you prove that you are needed. And how do they decide whether you're needed? Well, they invite the existing businesses to protest and come in and testify that you're not needed because you would take away business from them.
Mhm.
And so they exist in a few industries. They started out in transportation. They were initially applied to railroads for economic reasons that really only apply to big infrastructure that takes up a lot of room, like that, a lot of money on the front end, railroads. Through an accident of history, effectively, it was then carried on to new forms of transportation. So you see them in modern days applied to things like moving companies. Why you need to prove that you're needed just to start a moving company? All you should need
Mhm.
to start a moving company is the ability to buy a truck, have some knowledge of the city, have enough muscle to pick up the furniture and slap your name on the side of a truck and have a
Mhm.
business. It's one of the quickest paths to entrepreneurship, or at least it should be, and yet it suffers from, one of the most anti-competitive regulations in America. And then they tried their hand out. The government tried their hand out, uh, because Congress tried it, to apply these laws in the medical industry in the
Mhm.
1970s. And they so quickly found out that it's a bad idea, that it's anti-competitive, that it limits access, therefore
Mhm.
driving up prices, driving down quality, that Congress immediately repealed all funding tied to certificate of need laws. But by then it was too late. These laws are already on the books. And once you have something like this on the books, they're very difficult to repeal because the incumbents want to keep them there because they
Mhm.
love having this monopoly power. And so now we see them in many states applied to medicine. And actually, we're seeing that in a few states they apply to schools. If you want to start a charter school or a private school, you have to get a certificate of need. So they're pretty far and few. Far and few in between, is that what they say,
Mhm.
in terms of what industries, but within those industries, they just wreak absolute havoc on
Yeah.
people. And one of the ways, as you were saying, this human cost, I can give you an example of one of my cases, probably one of my favorite cases I've ever litigated, and that's the case of Ursula Newell Davis. She lives in New Orleans. She is a social worker there. She's an entrepreneur. She's a mother to a special needs child. And so, through her work as a social worker, she saw that parents of special needs children need help, caregiving.
Mhm.
They need relief from caregiving. Anybody who has dealt or been close to someone with a special needs child in their family knows that it's very taxing. Any type of caregiving is, and that these people they need relief, but they're not necessarily just going to call up some stranger, or maybe they will, but they want to be able to have choice between these strangers. They're not going to necessarily take the first person that they call. They want autonomy over this very personal decision,
Mhm.
especially when it involves special needs children who cannot always communicate, what's happening to them if they're happy in their situation. Parents need options. And being a mother to a special needs child, Ursula knew this. And so she was like, I need to go start a respite care business to give these parents a break and to give them support. Because she saw as a social worker that if parents do not have support, they
Mhm.
often either sacrifice that time that they need to do errands or to go to their job or just to have some freedom getting, your hair washed, just, that basic freedom to themselves. They sacrifice that or they leave their children unattended at home. And so she saw these children being left home, not doing their homework or not brushing their teeth, not making themselves food, getting teased the next day at school because they're wearing the same thing 2 days in a row. And she wanted to help. And she thought that having been a social worker for 2 decades and a mother to a special needs child, there's nobody more equipped in Louisiana than her. But there is a certificate of need law for respite workers. And so when she went and applied, the Louisiana Department of Health sent her a 2-page form letter saying there's already enough respite care businesses in the state. And Ursula said there might be 100 respite care businesses, but there is no Ursula Newell Davis.
Mhm.
In other words, the number is not just about numbers. It's not, yes, there might be an adequate number of providers in a state. But what's important is not just numbers, it's people. It's some people want Ursula. Her clients wanted her. They don't trust
Mhm.
anybody else. They have a long-lasting relationship with her. Or other people might just not be satisfied with their caregiver and they want the choice to try someone out like Ursula. And so you can see how when we talk about economic regulations in terms of numbers, yeah, are there well, sure, there are enough by number businesses in the
Mhm.
state, but um, what's enough is really a matter of personal choice and about the human component, about, getting your needs met. And also on Ursula's side, letting her why shouldn't she have a chance? Who cares if there's enough providers? Doesn't she deserve an equal chance to go out there and open her doors
Mhm.
and make a living for herself? And so I think the case is just a really good illustration of how terrible these laws can be, both on the provider side and the patient side.
Mhm. Well, one of the other things that frustrates me so much about that, about like sort of who defines need, is that it's just a numeric. Like, so first of all, obviously, it's the competitor's veto, right? So like the competitors are
Mhm.
deciding like what kind of care is being offered. Um, and so in my research, which is on healthcare, and then the cases that you and I overlapped on were primarily maternity care and birth center cases. And one of the things that I found so irritating about this is that, I when I first got pregnant with my first daughter, this was 13 years ago, I wanted a birth center birth because for a lot of reasons, we weren't comfortable with a home birth, but we knew that we didn't want a fully medicalized hospital birth. And so, I went out there. I'm an academic. I have a PhD. I was like, all right, we know what we want. Let's go find it. It didn't exist. So the closest birth center was, an hour and a half away. I would have had to, I'm not going to drive an hour and a half in labor. Um, so I just started like poking around, and so New York, of course, has a certificate of need law, and one of the things that I found so frustrating about it is that some bureaucrat in Albany decided that a specific kind of maternity care is what counted, right? So we have enough obstetric beds in New York State, according to them, that we don't need more of whatever these other kinds are. But I didn't want the standard kind of maternity care bed, right? I didn't want a hospital birth for very specific kinds of reasons that were actually very well researched and had a lot of personal background and values to them too. And similarly, one of the cases that I found the most heartbreaking was a woman that I was working with. We were sort of working together during the pandemic to try to advocate for more for birth center to ease up birth center regulations. But she was a woman of color, a doula in the Bronx. And one of the things that she wanted to do was serve her community. And especially during COVID, when you had just the hospitals were overwhelmed. There was a period of time in New York where women were not allowed to have support people in the hospital with them when they gave birth. So you're giving birth isolated, alone, in a mask. Like, it's just a terrifying situation. And you add in that a whole cultural and historical legacy of women of color being abused in the medical system. And so this doula thought, I want to start a birth center in the Bronx. Um, and when I tell this story, I often have people ask me, like, now that it's 6 years later, well, what happened? I said, well, nothing happened. She doesn't have a birth center. Like, there's no happy ending when, like,
Yeah.
because what happened in this case was she had, I mean, the New York state laws require something like, almost $500,000 of just expenses, to get off the ground before you can open a small outpatient clinic. So, you know, to me, I think the thing that is the most harmful is that those kinds of, when you allow other people to decide what is enough, it standardizes sort of human values and goals in a way that simply doesn't represent, like, there were probably parents in New Orleans who wanted the very specific type of care that Ursula could provide because their kids had a similar kind of personality or needs as her kid. And so they felt a connection to her. So the fact that there's numerically enough sort of providers and some, like, who gets to decide, right? And so that's what sort of makes me so frustrated on the maternity care side is it's someone else, and actually, spoiler, in this case, it's a bunch of, like, white men in Albany mostly, deciding for me what kind of care is appropriate for my body. And I just found that, like, deeply angering.
Well, yeah, and it's crazy that these cases are so difficult to win exactly because courts have decided that this right isn't important. When you can see from these stories that, these economic regulations are affecting some of the most private and intimate decisions of our lives, where we give birth, who's in the room with us when we give birth, where we give birth, or who takes care of our special needs children, who watches my kid. I mean, nothing is more personal and intimate and fundamental than that. And yet courts have said that these rights, they don't affect anything fundamental. So we're just going to defer to the legislature and let these laws stand. And even there, that just brings up the irony we were talking about at the beginning of all of this, that really the right to earn a living is one of the most fundamental rights you can think of. And yet it's treated the worst in our society.
I think maybe one of the reasons why the certificate of need laws are not, like, widely understood and rejected is because it sounds like it's this very dry, like, oh, this is just between these, like, large businesses, right? They have to work this out. It's impersonal. It's not a human story. But, I think when you're talking about regulation and costs that are as as tremendous as these are, like, no, the people who will not be able to open their businesses are the small ones, right? Like, it's going to be an individual entrepreneur. It's going to be a small company that can't get over these regulatory hurdles. It's not going to be another branch of your state's primary hospital chain. And so it is something that's, like, affecting your ability to get access to services you need. And I think in medicine, especially, people have the experience of, like, oh, I needed imaging and I can't get it because the closest one is an hour away and they're booked a month ahead of time, right? Like, that's not a good feeling to have.
Yeah, it reminds me, there's one other story that this all reminds me of a group of Hasidic women in Brooklyn, I believe. But they live in a Hasidic community. And, in that community, it's really verboten to have interactions between women and men who are not married. So they don't even shake hands with men that are not married, right? That's their cultural and religious norm. And so they wanted to start there an all women's EMT service to treat these women when they are in very private, personal, intimate situations. I mean, medical situations often, it involves our bodies. You might maybe partial nudity, what have you. And so they really only felt comfortable with an all women's EMT service and Hasidic women from that community. And it was the exact same thing where the health commissioner there said, no, there's already enough businesses. Again, bringing out, well, need is not about a numerical need. It's about the wants and needs of individual people. And that's why we can't have other people in charge of this. But like you said, who's it going to hurt? If people have the stigma against big businesses, well, guess what? These economic regulations are actually often enacted at the behest of big businesses to keep
Hmm.
those businesses big and to keep out the little guy. And it's always going to hurt the little guy more than anybody else.
Yeah. This is one of those topics that I get a little bit hopeful about, not because I think certificate of need, like, I mean, I've given up on New York State, like, in general, but I do get a little bit of hope. I feel a little hopeful about this from like a bridging perspective, because it's one of the major policy areas that I think you see progressives, libertarians, conservatives, like everyone agrees, like when they find out about these laws, they're like, what? And
Yeah.
and so the defenders of it, I actually have not heard any like principled defenses of it. It just ends up being like just like the economic self-interest of the people
Mhm.
in whatever industry it is. And that's like a really hard thing to defend. Like, yeah, we're gonna screw all these other people over just so that my business doesn't have to face competition. So, and I also think that it's been really helpful for a lot of, progressive folks that I know to see the regressive effects of these regulations, right? So, to your point, this isn't harming big corporations, right? This isn't like taking chunks out of the billionaires' pockets. Like, it's preventing like doulas of color in the Bronx from
Mhm.
serving their communities, and so like this is like a big problem. Like this isn't something that like you can overlook because it only affects people on like the margins of Fortune 500 companies, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think I'm hopeful too, because as you said, it's really not a left right issue. And we invite people to debate all the time. Let's have a debate about certificate of need laws. We can never find anyone who will take the other side. It's because what are they going to say? The research is one sided. It's incredibly one sided. Um, which goes to show, kind of what we were talking about earlier, about why I got into this. And that's because you can have all the research on your side in the world. And if you don't
Mhm.
communicate those things well, you're not going to change anybody's mind. I mean, here we also have the obstacle that we're fighting against very powerful incumbents who don't want those laws changed. But I think another part of that is translating all of that research to human stories that move people and show them just how important it is that we get these laws off the books. It's not just, dry numbers about, well, there's X number less birth centers than there would be in the absence of these laws. It's no, you are harming these women who now can't start these very important businesses. And now it means that one woman is going to have to, give birth in a hospital against her will. And, we saw in Georgia, we had one of these lawsuits where, because there was such a lack of birth centers, women were giving birth in the halls because they're of hospitals because there weren't enough beds. I mean, these are real
Mhm.
world effects that we need to communicate people that like you said, it's not just numbers, it's humans.
Mhm. Absolutely. Well, we have a long list of questions. Lauren, do you want to do you want to jump in with one, or do you want to? Yeah. So we could go in kind of two directions. One is this one. I mean, so this one's kind of related, and then we can actually jump to the other one that I was curious about. But um, to your point, though, about laws being hard to get off the books, this is, I think a lot of people see a problem and think that the solution to that problem is like, well, let's pass a law, right? Like you have that, like, there ought to be a law kind of comment. And I think it's really hard to communicate to people not just the cost of like this particular law, but how that law interacts with other laws that already exist, how it compounds different kinds of, uh, you know, the effects of other kinds of laws. And then, of course, how that law is going to be used by people in power, whether those are the people in economic power or political power, right? Um, but then also just how hard it is to get rid of it, right? And so, um, I wonder if you can sort of talk broadly about sort of the problem that people don't have a lot of experience with, what happens when well-intentioned laws go off the rails. But then also the problem of like how hard it is to get rid of them once they're entrenched.
Yeah, 100%. There is this instinct that when any tragedy happens, we have to go legislate it away. And the problem is that the legislature, it turns out, is not great at protecting the rights of the most vulnerable in society. The politically powerless obviously have the least say and least power over how these laws are drafted. And the laws, although we all like to believe that laws are drafted, in our own best interest, they often just consolidate power for people in charge or big incumbent groups. And so it's definitely a problem. And I think occupational licensing is a really good example of that. It's something that, you see a hairdresser who misuses chemicals, and so then the reaction is, "Oh, now we need a new licensing scheme where you have to have even more years of experience and training to become a hairdresser." And what's lost in all of that is you can regulate, of course, harm and real threats to harm, but when you put on a blanket law answer like that, then what happens is you keep people out of the profession, and the people who need economic opportunity the most and don't have the money to navigate complex regulatory schemes or spend tens of thousands of dollars for years in cosmetology school. So, yeah, it's definitely an instinct that I think is problematic and we need to step away from. And then, like you said, once they're there, they're almost impossible to get off the books because incumbents are going to lobby for them to stay on, and the courts don't care. They don't really want to be in the business of getting involved, of getting them off the books, unless it's something like First Amendment rights, these privileged rights in society. And even then, there's just so many traps in the legal system that make it difficult for civil rights plaintiffs of all kinds to sue. It's really difficult to get into court and to stay into court. I thought when I became a constitutional attorney, it was going to be this glamorous thing where you're in the courtroom all the time and you're making arguments over what's right. The majority of it is fighting over procedural things like, is my client harmed enough, even though they're obviously harmed, but the government's saying, oh, they're not harmed enough to get into court, or you have to wait till this point. And then when you get to that point, they say, no, you waited too long to get into court.
Mhm.
So much of it is all this gamesmanship that just makes it really difficult for civil rights plaintiffs to get into court and to get constitutional lawsuits heard. And so the point is once a law's there, it's very difficult to walk it back. And so we need to be really careful about which laws go on the books, and be thoughtful about that, and not assume that it's a panacea to everything, but rather be very circumspect about this process.
Mhm. Another thing that, so one of our listeners had that same question in the chat, which was, why do laws stay on the books? Is it that there's like a lack of empathy? But another thing that happens with these kinds of regulations is that they disappear into the background structure. And so I remember when I was interviewing midwives when I was first starting out my research, I asked them like, why doesn't New York have any birth centers? And the standard answer I got from midwives operating in New York was, well, it's just not a profitable enough business
Mhm.
model. And what they didn't realize was that the only reason it wasn't profitable enough is that there's this giant regulatory cost up front that means that you will never recover from that, right? So it's artificially a terrible business
Right.
model, right? But because nobody could untease the sort of natural market limitations from the regulatory limitations, it's really hard to animate people around these kinds of rights because it's hard to get that critical mass of people. It's hard to get a critical mass of like midwives and doulas who are just busy people, but also then educating them about sort of how they're being impacted. So I don't even think it's always that like legislators don't care. It's that there's so many of these regulations and a lot of them they've become part of the background structure of doing business in a way that they're not challenged in the same way that like barriers to voting would be or barriers to speech would be.
Yeah, absolutely. There are, a few of these laws, like certificate of need laws, where they're so obviously, and palpably unjust and unconstitutional. But, so many of the other things that we find when we get contacted by entrepreneurs and small businesses is that it's not any one regulation that you could really isolate and take to court and challenge and explain to the judge how this is keeping somebody out of a profession unfairly. It's what we call the regulatory thicket. It's a thicket
Mm,
of regulations where any one regulation unto itself might seem
mhm,
justifiable. It doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal. But when you combine it with 1,000 other regulations, it just makes it too expensive, too time consuming, too difficult to start the business. And then on top of that, you get somebody who kind of looks into starting the business. They see all of these regulations and they just choose to do something else. And so you don't see the human cost of, they had a business and then it was taken away. Or if you're looking for a provider of something and you can't find one, it's hard to trace it back to not having that person who never started the business. They're not there
Mhm.
to say, I would have been there, I could have
Yeah.
been there, because they've just moved on, like you said. And I think that's another thing that makes it difficult to translate to people the real world harm of these regulations.
Mhm. One more quick, this is another thing Laura and I were talking about before we went live. I mean, another thing that I think people don't realize is the shift from, at the time of the founding, the vast majority of Americans were small business owners, right? It was a very
Mm.
flat, like in terms of hierarchy. Like we often hear about sort of like wealthy people, but actually most people were small business owners. They had a lot of autonomy. They had a lot of control over their livelihoods and the choices that they made. And flash forward today, and most people are employees. And one of the reasons for that, right? Like we just missed the fact that one of the reasons for that, of course, is that like it's become really, really hard to start a small business. It's become really hard. And that thicket of regulations, if I were looking into starting a small business right now, I would look at it and go, yeah, there's no way that I'm risking my family's, you know, economic stability on the off chance that this works and that I can make it through this maze. Um, and so it changes the entire sort of structure of society in ways that I think we actually often don't really pay that close of attention to.
Mhm. Yeah, that's so right. And that's why, I often think, my clients are like the bravest people out there, exactly because they are willing to invest their own time and resources um, into trying it, into this great experiment of trying it with no guarantee that it's going to work, and in a regulatory climate that's very difficult. Um, and they're willing to do it to try to make other people's lives and their own lives better, because they're not going to be successful unless they make other people's lives better, right? That's what using a business is. I just think they're so brave, and why shouldn't we give them a chance to try? Because that's one of the things we see in certificate of need um, cases is the government says, well, there's already enough providers. And so if you let somebody new in the market, they're not going to make it, and it's going to be a waste of resources, or they're going to take business away from that guy, and that guy's going to fail. Well, that's competition. That's America. And why shouldn't people be able to try that great experiment, risking no harm to anybody else, but only themselves? That's what entrepreneurship is, and it's a beautiful and dangerous experiment for people, but it's what makes them so brave. I think truly some of the bravest people in society.
Yeah. You started off earlier talking about the impact that law has on culture. And I was wondering, another thing we've kind of touched on here is like just how difficult it is to bring a suit to say this law is impacting me unfairly. And so I was curious what you think. I think a lot of people have the perception that like this is a very litigious country and like this is kind of our culture. But I was wondering if it looks the same from your vantage point, or like how do you see law affecting culture?
Yeah, in terms of being litigious, so they say, right, about
Right.
Americans. I mean, I practice a very niche type of law, suing the government, constitutional law. And I will say that everybody seems to think that I think generally there's a perception that the Supreme Court is far too involved in our life, and they're hearing too many cases and making too big of decisions, and everything's been constitutionalized and funneled through the courts. But that's not the court's fault. That's government's fault. If there's
Mhm.
less government, there's less lawsuits, less things to challenge. And so, the court is forced to be in this position because there's such broader assertions of powers going on at both the state and federal level. And so I think if you want the courts out of our lives, well, the solution is to get government out of our lives. The court needs to be there when there's more government, because they're the last bulwark against constitutional overreach. When the political process fails us, when
Mhm.
legislators do not care and they steamroll and they violate the political minorities' rights, the last thing we've got, because I mean, obviously the legislative process has failed. You can't go there and ask for help. The last thing we've got is the courts. And so, to the extent that people always complain about there being too many lawsuits, constitutional lawsuits, I'm like, no, that's a good thing. And the solution is to get rid of government. And also, being a constitutional litigator, again, I'll just say how difficult it actually is to maintain a constitutional lawsuit. And people would be shocked. Courts will bend over backwards to kick your lawsuit out of court. They don't want it. They don't want any of that smoke. They don't want the judgment, the you know the criticism that comes along with
Mhm.
striking down a government policy, the responsibility that people throw on them if a law gets repealed and then the government says, now, of course, the government always says, people will die if you repeal this law, no matter what it is.
Mhm.
Courts don't want that. And they actually really will invoke all sorts of doctrines to get your case out of court. So, I think from the vantage point of a constitutional litigator, I would say there's not enough constitutional lawsuits.
More lawsuits.
Yeah, right.
Mhm. So one of the things we do is we link politics or we try to like sort of elucidate the links between sort of politics and private lives, including families. And I think we've already actually touched on like a number of ways that like these economic regulations impact families. But are there other ways that you see your work sort of linking up with sort of like family life broadly? This kind of goes to Laura's overall point about sort of like the culture, but thinking about ways that we are um, harming sort of the way that people think about themselves and organize themselves into families.
Yeah, that's interesting. A lot of, I think probably so many small businesses are family started, family owned. And so I do see a lot of impact on families, whether that's because it's a family owned business or it's because we're dealing with cases that involve intimate personal decisions like giving
Mhm.
birth, starting schools. Have some cases involving entrepreneurs of private schools who are unable to start up. Of course, that involves very personal, intimate decisions about how you want your kids educated, having choices over care for your children. The respite case, it's interesting how many of these cases do touch family life. And, I don't know what else to say about that except for it always does strike me as really infuriating when you hear, people or courts saying that these cases, don't involve important fundamental
Mhm.
rights exactly because they're touching on some of the most
Mhm.
personal decisions we make in a day,
Yeah, and important to who would be my follow-up question.
right?
Well, could you talk a little bit about, you talked about some of the cases you worked on, but I'm wondering, like, is there one that stands out in your mind as like the case you're most proud of or made the biggest difference?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, Ursula stands out to me just because she's such a hero to me. The first time that I met her, she was late. I had flown to New Orleans to meet her in person when deciding whether to take the case. She was late for the meeting because she was standing in line at the grocery store and there was an elderly man in front of her who was kind of struggling to make a medical appointment, and she's just a born doer. She advocate. She's a social worker, and so she had taken the phone from him and said, "Let me," and made the appointment for him, right, and gotten him access that he needed, and made sure he had a ride there and everything. And I was just so inspired by her, and she's trying to help special needs kids, which I'm very passionate about too. Seeing that just that families need help, they need respite. Hearing the stories from the parents that she had helped, saying, Ursula changed my whole life. I don't know what I would have done without her. I lost my job. She helped me find a job, got my kids' grades up. She was just such a hero to me. That one stands out. But there are a few others, and they're all certificate of need laws, incidentally, in different industries. So
Mhm.
I also had a
Mm.
case, a moving business certificate of need case where the man Artie Vogt had started his well, he had started at a moving business that had been in operation for 100 years, right? This moving business starts as a horse and buggy operation in West Virginia, where they're just like helping their neighbors move with a horse and buggy. But over 100 years, it becomes a full-fledged moving business and moderately successful small business in the local community. And he started as a driver there after high school. And over time, he saved up enough money to, with his wife Stephanie, buy the company. And he didn't know when he bought the company that the certificate of need does not automatically transfer over. You have to reapply for
Oh
it.
my gosh.
So here he is operating. He's just bought this company with his wife, used his life savings to do it. And a competitor finds out that he's operating without the certificate of need, rats him out, and he gets cited and told you have to stop operating immediately. And he thinks, well, I'll just apply for a certificate of need. How hard could it be? This business has been existent for over 100 years. It's clearly needed, it's
Mhm.
self sufficient. And of course, tens of thousands of dollars later, in a year of his life, he and his wife Stephanie are denied because the government decides, no, 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 all the other businesses have said that you're not needed. So I took his case on, and right before I took it, his wife during this whole fight had gotten cancer and passed away. And so I
Mhm.
called him up and I said, "Hey, do you want to be a client?" And he said he thought it was, it was fraud. Like, when do you ever get a call? I'd like to represent you for free. And he's like, "What? This sounds sketchy."
Mhm.
But eventually, after talking to him long enough, he decided he wanted to carry on Stephanie's fight. And we were very deep in the briefing, about to file the final briefs when the legislature repealed the certificate of need law. And he said that there's a very moving video of it online where he said that he was gonna name it for himself Stephanie's Law in honor of his wife because she was the one who had spearheaded that fight to get the certificate of need. And I found that really moving. I really loved the client. I adored him. And, I was trying to contact him a couple years ago and he wasn't responding, which was very odd for him. And I Googled him and it turned out he had passed away. And
Mhm.
I found his obituary. That's how I learned, and it's very short, right? It's very basic. Artie Vogt grew up in West Virginia, married to Stephanie. Stephanie passed away. Um, it said one, and then it said one of the proudest things in his life was having helped pass Stephanie's Law in West Virginia, and it just really touched me. Out of all the things that he could have said or that could have been in there, that's what his family chose. That was one of the most fulfilling things to him, and just to know that you're doing something that, it's not necessarily on the front pages of USA Today that, we got a certificate of need law for moving businesses repealed in West Virginia, but it really meant something to Artie. And it's something that I'll just always be very, very, very proud of.
Well, just to drill down to the point that you made earlier, like I guess I just wish that like people could like I've been working really hard to like sort of move into like perspective, like more perspective taking of like, what would this be like on the other side of this? Like what would this be like to like live through this, like walking through this particular situation, like for this person. And, just like that example, I think people like, oh, some moving company couldn't stay in business. Like, who cares? But when you think about like how much time you spend at work and how much time work, like what work means or can't mean to people, right? Like how alienating the workplace can be, how like for those of us who have been stuck in an unhappy job or like who just are in a kind of like workspace that doesn't play to their talents or desires, like to find work that you really care about that is meaningful to you, that should be one of the most foundational rights that we have. And to your point earlier, it was right. Like one of the crucial things that we fought for in this country was the freedom to own your own labor. And now we're just sort of like, man, like you'll find a different job.
Yeah.
Like one less moving company doesn't really matter. But I think people just need to like again peel back the layers, and this is why I think these human stories are so powerful because again, it like really. I was lucky enough to meet Ursula at one of the conferences that you guys invited me down for. I can't remember which one it was, but just like she's just like this like absolute powerhouse, right? And she's gonna do amazing stuff no matter what. But we're denying all these people the opportunity to have Ursula in their lives. And that's just like a huge loss as well. So I don't know. I guess I just wish people would like peel back some of these, like get to the individual level and really think about the human costs in a more meaningful way, which we don't do often enough, I don't think.
Yeah, that reminds me of something, when you were saying, why did you get into doing more external
Mhm.
communication sort of rather than just litigating? One of the reasons why also was that we live in a world where hot takes are all that sells and everyone wants a hot take. You can't
Mhm.
get, if a reporter calls you up, if you don't have that spicy soundbite or hot take, I don't know if you're getting into the newspaper. And I for one just at least wanted to bring back nuance. Not everything has to be black or white or so intense. What about just saying that these are difficult situations and it's not
Mhm.
always what you think, especially within law? Law is not just pure partisan politics. It's actually very often very difficult and complex. And there's all sorts of reasons why Supreme Court cases come out the way that they do. And I wanted to bring back that nuance, but that kind of reminds me of that, stepping out of what you think you
Mhm.
immediately assume should be the right answer, or taking the most craziest position on something and just bringing back, nuanced, lukewarm takes about stepping outside of yourself and seeing the other side a little bit.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's such a great point. Well, we're reaching the end of the hour we have with you, and we always like to wrap up these conversations by ending on a hopeful and optimistic note. So I'm wondering, what is something that you're hopeful about this week? It sounds like your work brings a lot of meaning to you and to other people, but what in particular is making you optimistic right now?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult political, cultural, social moment, and it's easy to get caught up in all of that and to doom scroll and think about the end of civilization as we know it. And was it last? I think it was last week or possibly the week before. I was speaking to a local Daughters of the American Revolution chapter, and they were talking about. They were doing all of this planning just to go out. They had found this abandoned graveyard, this cemetery, and they were going to go clean the graves, and they were going to replace any American flags with. They were going to do a flag retirement ceremony and put in the new flags. And there was something about just that, like local charity
Mm.
aspect, these women just not caring about anything else, just going out and doing something in their own backyard, and something about that was just so beautiful to me, and it made me think that, I really wanted to, unplug and try to engage in some of that with my own kids and family, and it just made me hopeful about, step away from the doom and gloom and get outside and do something local in your community, and that's where real meaning and fulfillment and joy comes from, and I don't know, I really just was so inspired after that meeting about these women who are just taking local matters like that into their own hands. They're fostering seeing eye dogs. They're just out there doing good work with no glory, and they're not
Mhm.
concerned about getting glory for it. And it really brought me joy. And so that's all I have for that's what I report back.
That's a lot. That's perfect. No, thank you so much. Well, this was really, really fun. Thank you so much for joining us. There's obviously tons more that we could talk about, but this was absolutely fantastic. And any sign offs or anything, Laura, before we close things out?
No, we will make sure we link to all of Anastasia's various channels in the show notes so that you can find her and follow her work and learn more about the law. So
Yeah.
thank you so much
And
for
really,
joining us. Oh, sorry.
really quickly, Anastasia, did you want to let people know just right now where a couple of sites to find you? And then we'll have everything like Laura said in the show notes.
Yep, my Instagram is SCOTUS_lady, Supreme Court of the United States. SCOTUS lady. My Twitter is Anastasia_ESQ. All of the great work at my nonprofit legal foundation can be found at pacificlegal.org. And lastly, I just started writing for SCOTUS blog about dissents. Dissents, Supreme Court dissents are like the last great place where you can have civil disagreement that's very intense on important matters, and yet it's still respectful, and it's transparent, and it's such a great model of disagreement, and yet consensus at the same time. So anyway, all of that can be found at SCOTUS blog. But yeah, that's about it.
Awesome. Thank you
Awesome.
so much. Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
ladies.
Bye. You've been listening to We Made This Political with Laura Forkham and Lauren Hall. You can find us on Substack, Instagram, or LinkedIn. The podcast Substack is We Made This Political. Laura's Substack is How to Human, and Lauren's Substack is The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life. Subscribe and share if you like what you hear, and please also rate and review on your favorite podcast platform. That really, really helps other people find our work and means a lot to us, too. Thanks for listening.